In the spring of 1989, Dale Schuster stood at the podium of the Crockett County Agricultural Extension meeting and said, with all the calm authority of a man who had earned his degree and read the literature and driven every road in that county twice, that a Sandhill pecan operation was not a farm. He said it was a hobby at best and a lesson at worst, and he said it in front of 63 ranchers and landowners who had come out on a Tuesday night and sat in folding chairs under fluorescent lights to hear what the county knew. Dale was not unkind about it. He never was. He looked in the direction of the back row where Clint Jennings sat with his hat in his lap and said, "I understand the appeal, Clint, I genuinely do. But that sandy ground won't hold the moisture a pecan tree needs to produce. You'll get bark and shade and not much else." 34 years later, in a kitchen in Crockett County, a woman named Ruth Jennings unfolded a purchase order from a regional nut buyer and read the figure at the bottom aloud to nobody in particular, because her mother was on the porch and the house was quiet, and reading it aloud was the only way to make it feel true. One harvest, one season, $187,000. Let me tell you about the ground that produced that number, because the ground is where the story lives. Clint Jennings had grown up on the western edge of the county, where the soil changed from the dark clay loam of the river bottoms to a pale, loose, free-draining sandhill that most cattlemen used for winter grazing and mostly ignored the rest of the year. His father had run stocker cattle on it, and his grandfather before that, and neither of them had ever thought to do anything else with it. The sandhill was considered poor ground in the county's unofficial ranking of land, the kind of thing you inherited because your family had always owned it, not because it was worth anything in particular. Clint had heard that assessment his entire life, and had accepted it for most of it. He was 62 years old in 1987 when he changed his mind, and the thing that changed it was a pecan tree. The tree was old, a native seedling that had rooted itself in a low draw at the south end of the Sandhill tract, where a little runoff pooled after rain. It had never been grafted or pruned or fertilized. Nobody had planted it or tended it. It had simply grown there for what Clint estimated was at least 50 years, finding whatever moisture it needed in a soil that Dale Schuster would later describe as inhospitable, and every other autumn it produced a small crop of thin-shelled native pecans that Clint's wife Ida had been picking and cracking for as long as he could remember. Ida said they tasted different from the pecans she bought at the feed store in town. She said they tasted like something. She had said it for years without either of them thinking much about it. Clint started thinking about it in 1987. He spent the spring and early summer walking the sandhill with a soil probe, reading the texture between his fingers at different depths, watching where the water went after rain, counting how quickly the surface dried. He drove to the county library and checked out 3 books on pecan culture that had not been checked out since 1974, and he sat at the kitchen table under the hanging light and read them with a yellow pencil in his hand. Ida brought him coffee. She watched him read and said nothing. She had been married to him for 31 years and had learned that his silences before a decision were working silences, not empty ones. What Clint read confirmed something he had already suspected from watching that native tree. Pecan roots, in well-drained sandy soil with a consistent but infrequent water supply, will extend downward in search of moisture to depths that roots in heavy clay or saturated bottomland will never reach. The technical term for this is a deep taproot system, and what it means in practice is that a tree with roots running 8 and 10 and 12 feet down is drawing from a moisture reservoir that summer heat cannot touch and a single dry month cannot drain. Clay soil holds moisture, near the surface where it is accessible to shallow roots. But those same shallow roots drown in a wet year, and the saturated soil becomes a perfect environment for a soil-borne pathogen called Phytophthora, a root rot organism that moves through wet ground the way a fire moves through dry grass. Sandy soil drains that moisture away before Phytophthora can establish. The tree survives the drought and survives the flood by virtue of the same characteristic. It has been forced, by the nature of its ground, to go deep. Clint did not know the word Phytophthora in 1987. He did not need it. He knew that the native tree in the draw had survived every dry summer and every wet one he could remember, and he believed the reason was the ground beneath it. That was enough to start. He ordered 40 grafted Pawnee variety pecan trees from a nursery in East Texas in the summer of 1987. Pawnee was a cultivar the USDA had released only 3 years earlier, suited to the climate of Central and West Texas, with a relatively thin shell and a high kernel-to-nut ratio that made it attractive to buyers. He planted them on the south-facing slope of the Sandhill tract in the fall of that year, spacing them 60 feet apart in rows oriented to catch the prevailing wind for pollination, working with a hand auger and a post-hole digger because the ground was loose enough to allow it. He planted each tree at the same depth, backfilled with the native sand and a small measure of composted cattle manure from his own pens, and then did something that would strike most orchardists as counterintuitive. He watered each tree once deeply, filling the planting hole twice over, and then he stopped. He did not install drip irrigation. He did not run a pipeline from the stock tank on the north end of the tract. He watered those 40 trees once at planting, and then he left them to find their own water. Ida started the journal that winter. It was a simple thing, a composition notebook from the school supply shelf at the hardware store in town, and she began it on the 1st of January, 1988, with a short entry about the weather and the condition of the trees. She wrote in it every week after that, noting rainfall, temperature, the appearance of new growth, the date the first catkins emerged in spring, the weight of any fall crop. Clint read what she wrote, but did not add to it for several years. He said he preferred to watch and let Ida do the writing. She said someone had to keep track, and she was right. Which brings us to the Tuesday night in October 1989, when Dale Schuster stood at that podium. Dale was 37 years old at the time and had been the county extension agent for 6 years. He had a master's degree in horticulture from Texas A&M University, and he had genuinely read the literature on pecan culture in the region. He was not a bad man, and he was not a careless one. He believed in what he was saying. The extension literature of that period recommended well-drained loam soils with a pH between 6 and 7 and a reliable supplemental irrigation source for commercial pecan production. Sandhill soils were not in the recommendation. Sandy soils were considered too nutrient-poor and too moisture-variable to sustain a producing grove at commercial scale. Dale was reading the map that had been drawn for him by people who had studied the question, and the map said what it said. That sandy ground won't hold the moisture a pecan tree needs to produce, he told the room. You'll get bark and shade and not much else. Clint looked at his hat. He turned it once by the brim. Then he said, "We'll see." And that was everything he said on the subject for the rest of that evening. 2 people in that room heard the exchange and remembered it. One was Boyd Hennessy, who farmed bottomland 2 miles east, and who had been thinking about diversifying into pecans for the previous year. Boyd heard Dale's assessment and filed it as confirmation of what he had already been inclined to believe. that serious production required serious ground, and serious ground meant the bottomland with its dark, moisture-retentive clay and its access to the river. The other person was Ida, who wrote the exchange down in the journal that night, verbatim in her careful handwriting. She wrote Dale's words first, and then she wrote Clint's two-word answer, and then she drew a thin line under it and wrote the date. Through the 1990s, Clint tended the Sandhill Grove the way he tended everything on his property, which is to say attentively and without drama. He did not irrigate. He did mow the native grass understory between the rows twice a year, not to eliminate it, but to keep it from competing with young trees while allowing it to persist as a living ground cover that reduced wind erosion and held the topsoil in place. Sandy soils, ungrazed and unprotected, are susceptible to wind scour in dry years, and the grass understory functioned as a windbreak at ground level, keeping the surface intact and moderating soil temperature through the hottest months. He applied zinc sulfate as a foliar spray each spring because pecan trees are heavy users of zinc, and sandy soils do not retain trace minerals the way heavier soils do. He applied it at a rate of 2 pounds per 100 gallons of water, spraying directly onto new spring growth before the leaves hardened off. Zinc deficiency in pecans shows as a distinctive rosetting of the terminal leaves, a stunted, clustered growth habit that signals the tree is not producing the enzymes it needs for normal shoot elongation. Clint had read about rosette disease in those library books in 1987, and he watched for it every spring. He never saw it in his grove. He also amended the soil in the tree rows with crushed granite screenings beginning in 1993, working a shallow layer into the top few inches of the sandhill around each tree's drip line. Granite screenings, the fine, gritty byproduct of quarry operations, carry trace minerals, including small amounts of iodine-adjacent compounds that, over years of slow weathering, release into the soil and become available to plant roots. The precise chemistry is complicated, and Clint would not have described it in chemical terms. What he knew was that the native tree in the draw had grown in ground that had been weathering granite-derived sand for centuries, and that tree produced pecans Ida said tasted like something. He was trying to reproduce that ground slowly, at a larger scale. He was working at the pace the ground allowed, which was not fast. By the early 2000s, the grove had expanded. Clint had planted additional trees across the 1990s in 3 successive stages, walking the sandhill each year and choosing the spots where the native grasses showed the strongest root depth and where the soil probe came up with the most consistent moisture reading at 4 feet down, indicators that the subsurface drainage was right. By 2003, he had 200 trees established and producing on roughly 50 acres of the Sandhill tract. He had taken no loans to do it. The expansion had come from the cash flow of his cattle operation and, beginning in 1998, from the modest early harvest of the grove itself. He was not getting rich. In 2001, the grove produced a harvest he sold through a local buyer for $31,000. In 2004, a late frost cut the crop in half, and he netted $14,000. He told Ida it was going to be a longer project than either of them had expected, and she said she had never expected it to be a short one. She wrote both statements in the journal. Ruth left for college in 1995, enrolled in the agronomy program at Texas Tech, which was her mother's suggestion and her own inclination. She had grown up watching her father tend the Sandhill Grove with the same unhurried attention he gave to everything, and she had neither fully understood what he was doing nor seen sufficient evidence at that point to find it compelling. The grove was a collection of young trees on pale, loose ground that produced a modest crop every other year and required her father to spend a great deal of time reading about zinc and walking with a soil probe. She loved him, but she did not think what he was doing was more than a large-scale garden project. She told a friend at college once that her father had planted pecans on Sandhill dirt, and the friend, also an agronomy student, laughed and said that sounded like a lot of work for not much result. Ruth had not disagreed. She came back in 2011. She was 34 years old by then, and her return was practical, not sentimental. Her mother had had a health scare the previous winter, nothing that turned out to be serious, but enough to make Ruth look at the distance between Lubbock, where she had been working for an agricultural consulting firm, and home, and decide the distance was too large. She came back intending to help run the cattle operation, and to see what her father's grove had actually become. What it had become was 280 trees on 70 acres, producing in alternate years with a reasonably consistent quality. She walked it the first week of October in 2011 with her father, and she watched him move between trees with the same deliberate attention she remembered from her childhood, stopping to crumble soil between his fingers, reading the leaf color, looking up through the canopy at the nut clusters hanging on the outer branches. The grove was real. She had not fully believed it would be. "You've never irrigated any of this," she said. It was not quite a question. "Not a drop," he said. She looked at the pale, free-draining soil between the rows and then looked at him. Her agronomy training was telling her that he should have lost trees in the dry years of 2006 and 2011. That sandy soil in a drought year would not hold enough moisture at root depth to sustain a mature pecan tree's water demand. The training was also telling her that she was standing in a healthy grove on sandy soil in a drought year, which meant either her training was incomplete or the trees had done something she had not accounted for. "The roots are going deeper than you'd expect," she said. Clint looked at her the way he looked at the grove when he was satisfied with something. "Deeper than most people would plant them," he said. "Deeper than they'd go in clay." It was one of the longer exchanges she had heard him have on the subject of his own work, and she understood that it was also, for him, as close to a lecture as he was prepared to give. She walked the rest of the grove in silence, and when they came back to the truck, she said, "You've got capacity here. You could add more trees at the east end where the drainage is still right." She had looked at the soil and the topography, and she meant it as a practical observation from someone who had studied the subject. He nodded. The following spring, he planted 40 more trees on the east end, the last planting he would do himself. That brought the grove to 320 trees, all Pawnee variety, across 80 producing acres of the 160-acre Sandhill tract. If you're finding this story useful, there are a lot more like it here. Stay with us a while. Now let me tell you about Boyd Hennessy, because understanding what happened to Boyd is part of understanding what Clint had actually built. Boyd was a good farmer and a reasonably careful man. He had been thinking about pecans since the late 1980s, and after listening to Dale Schuster at that 1989 meeting, he had identified his bottomland as the right ground for a commercial orchard. The bottomland was exactly what the extension literature called for. Well-drained loam with good moisture retention, access to irrigation from the river, pH in the right range. He planted his first 100 trees in 1992 and expanded in stages through the 1990s, and by the time Ruth came back in 2011, his operation had grown to 400 trees on 100 acres and he was pulling in harvests that Clint's early grove could not match in raw weight per acre. Between 2013 and 2016, Boyd financed a major expansion. He borrowed $340,000 over 5 years from an agricultural lender, planted an additional 200 trees to bring his total to 600 across 120 acres, and installed a second pumping system for his irrigation infrastructure. The operation at peak looked like what success was supposed to look like in the conventional model: high tree density, managed irrigation, consistent moisture, a clean management record. He was selling forward contracts to regional buyers who valued volume and consistency. He was, by every metric the county recognized, doing things right. Boyd came by the Sandhill in the summer of 2015 to look at the Jennings Grove. He walked it with Ruth, who had been managing day-to-day operations for 2 years by then, while Clint's knees had begun to slow him. Boyd was respectful and curious and not unkind in the way he phrased his observation, which was that the tree spacing seemed conservative, and the ground seemed like it might benefit from supplemental irrigation in a dry year. Ruth told him the grove had never been irrigated. Boyd looked at the pale sand between the rows and said he supposed Clint had always done things his own way. He said it as a compliment, or close to one. What Boyd did not know, and what the county's bottomland orchardists were not yet watching for, was that 3 consecutive wet springs in 2015, 2016, and 2017 had saturated the river-bottom soils across a wide area of the county. Phytophthora cinnamomi, the specific organism responsible for pecan root rot, does not kill trees quickly. It works through the feeder roots first, compromising the tree's ability to draw nutrients, then moves into the lateral root system over a period of 2 to 3 growing seasons. A tree showing the early signs of Phytophthora infection in 2016 might not show visible canopy decline until 2018, by which time the organism has established through the root zone, and the tree is already dying. The saturated bottomland soils of Crockett County in 2015 and 2016 were providing exactly the conditions the organism required, and the infections were already moving through the root zones of hundreds of trees across the county, while the canopies above them still looked healthy. The county agent, who came through in the spring of 2017, was a younger man who had replaced Dale Schuster after Dale's retirement. He looked at the bottomland orchards and reported them in good condition. He was reading the canopy, which was the visible evidence. The invisible evidence was 6 inches underground. The decline became visible in 2018. Boyd noticed the first trees failing that June, the leaves yellowing at the margins and dropping early, the nut clusters sparse and underdeveloped on the outer branches. By August, he had walked the orchard 3 times and counted 140 trees, showing decline in varying degrees. He called the extension office, and the new agent came out and pulled soil cores and identified Phytophthora in the feeder roots of 6 trees across 3 different rows. There was no treatment at scale. Soil fumigation was impractical across 120 acres of established orchard. The only reliable intervention was removal and replanting in soil where the moisture conditions could be corrected, which meant Boyd's bottomland was not recoverable without a drainage system whose cost he could not finance against an operation that was already failing. By the fall of 2018, roughly 70% of the bottomland pecan acreage in Crockett County had shown Phytophthora-related decline. The losses ran across 6 properties, including Boyd's. Boyd's harvest that fall was approximately 12% of a normal year's production. He could not meet the debt service on his expansion loan at that level of revenue. He held on through the winter, sold off equipment, applied for an operating loan extension, and sold the grove at auction in the spring of 2019. The auction recovered $41,000 net after the remaining debt was settled. He had borrowed $340,000. Clint's grove that same fall showed nothing. Not a tree lost, not a root system compromised, not a feeder root with the characteristic blackening and decay that defines Phytophthora infection. Ruth walked every row in September 2018 with the same soil probe her father had used for 30 years, pulling cores at 2 feet and 4 feet, and reading the moisture and the texture, looking for the gray-brown discoloration in the soil that indicated standing water in the root zone. The Sandhill drained freely. It had always drained freely. That was why her father had planted there. The 2018 harvest came in at a net of $89,000. It was the best season the grove had produced to that point. Dale Schuster came to the Sandhill in November 2019. He was 67 years old by then, retired for 3 years, and he drove out in his personal truck, not a university vehicle, and knocked at the farmhouse door on a Thursday morning. Ruth answered it. Clint was on the porch with a cup of coffee, and Dale walked over to him and shook his hand and said he had been thinking about coming for a long time. The three of them walked the grove. Dale had been watching the county's bottomland losses with the attention of a man reviewing his own prior judgments, and he had read the recent literature on Phytophthora in pecan roots and on the drainage requirements that prevent it, and he understood by then what he had missed in 1989. The literature he had read in his graduate training had emphasized moisture retention as a positive characteristic of suitable pecan soil. What it had not sufficiently weighted was the cost of that retention in a wet cycle. The sandy soil recommendation in the newer literature was more nuanced than it had been, acknowledging that free-draining soils with deep-root adaptation could outperform heavier soils in any year with above-average rainfall. Dale had been right about the average year. He had been wrong about the year that decided things. He stopped at the end of the south-facing row and looked down the line of trees toward the draw, where the native seedling had stood for decades. He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked Ruth a question that told her he had done his reading. "How deep are the roots running?" he asked. "We cored to 12 feet in 2016, she said. Found active roots at 11 feet 2 inches. Dale looked at the sandhill soil under his boots. He was wearing work boots, not clean ones. He had come to learn something. "I got that wrong," he said. "I read the average, and I didn't think hard enough about what happens at the margins." Ruth said, "My father knew what the average would look like." She paused. "He was planning for the year the average failed." Dale nodded slowly. He spent another hour in the grove asking about the zinc amendments and the granite screenings and the deep watering protocol at planting, and Ruth answered each question from a combination of her own agronomy training and what she had read in her mother's journal. Clint walked with them and said almost nothing, which was his way, but when they reached the native tree in the draw and Dale stood looking at it, Clint said, "That tree showed me what the ground could do. I tried to give the others the same chance to find out." It was more than he usually said, and both Ruth and Dale understood it was also a complete explanation. Clint's health declined through 2020 and into 2021. His heart had been unreliable since a mild event in 2019, and by the spring of 2021 he was spending most of his time on the porch or at the kitchen table rather than in the grove. Ruth managed everything. She had moved the cattle operation to a simpler stocker model that required less daily attention, and had concentrated her time on the grove, which by 2021 was producing at the highest level it had ever reached. The 2020 harvest had brought in $112,000, still short of the grove's full potential, but a number that told her the trees were approaching their mature producing years. Clint died in July 2021 on a Tuesday morning in his own house, with Ida beside him and Ruth in the kitchen making coffee she didn't end up drinking. He was 96 years old. He had spent 34 years tending a grove on ground that the county's best credentialed expert had told a room of 63 people was unsuitable for the purpose, and he had not argued the point with anyone. He had simply continued. After the service, Ida took the Grove Journal from its shelf above the kitchen table and held it in her lap for a long time. It was a collection of 11 composition notebooks by then, rubber-banded together, the earliest ones with covers gone soft and pages stained with what Ruth suspected was coffee. Ida handed the stack to Ruth and said, "He started reading them over again in the last 2 years. He'd sit here in the evenings and go back through the early ones." She smoothed the cover of the top notebook with her palm. "He never changed anything he'd written. He said the record should be what he actually saw, not what he knew afterward." Ruth took the journals to the kitchen table and read them over the following 3 evenings. She read her father's occasional additions, which had become more frequent in his final decade, short notes in the margin about root behavior he'd observed when replanting a tree, about the way certain rows responded to a heavy spring rain, about the years the zinc spray had made a visible difference in the terminal growth. She read Ida's entry from October 1989, the verbatim record of Dale Schuster's assessment, and her father's 2-word answer. She read an entry from the summer of 2011, a few weeks after she had walked the grove with Clint and told him the roots were going deeper than she'd expect. Ida had written, "Ruth is starting to see it." She had not known that entry was there. She sat with it for a while. The grove produced well in 2022, a transitional harvest of approximately $130,000. But 2023 was the year the grove reached its full potential. The 2023 growing season was dry in spring and wet in early summer, the specific sequence that pecan trees in well-drained sandy soil respond to most favorably. The spring dry period deepened root activity as the trees pushed their root systems further in search of moisture. The early summer rains recharged the deep moisture reservoir those roots had reached without creating the surface saturation that would have threatened a shallower-rooted tree in heavier soil. The nut clusters that year were dense and well-filled, and the Pawnee variety's thin shell and high kernel percentage showed at their best when the trees had adequate moisture at depth without the canopy stress of a fully dry season. Ruth harvested 320 trees across 80 producing acres. She ran a mechanical harvester over the rows twice in October and weighed the crop at the processor's scales. The average yield across the producing acres came in at approximately 1,400 pounds per acre. She sold the harvest to a regional buyer through a contract she had been working toward for 2 years, a buyer who specialized in premium native soil pecans for the specialty food market, and who was willing to pay for the flavor distinction that Ida had been describing in her journal for 30 years. The price was $2.50 per pound. The purchase order arrived in late November. Ruth sat at the kitchen table where her father had read those library books in 1987 and where Ida still made coffee every morning, and she unfolded the single sheet of paper and read the figure at the bottom. $187,000. She sat with it for a moment. Ida was on the porch, and the house was quiet, and outside the kitchen window the Sandhill Grove stood in the low November light. the trees gray-barked and spare, with the leaves nearly gone, looking like what you would expect to see on ground that the county had always described as poor. Ruth read the number aloud again, quietly, to the table and the light in the room. Then she stood and walked to the porch. Ida was in the wooden chair that had been on that porch since before Ruth was born, looking out toward the tree line where the Sandhill tract began. Ruth held out the purchase order, and Ida took it and held it in the slant morning light and read it without any visible change in her expression, which was her own kind of answer. He knew, Ida said. Not triumphant, just level, the way a fact sounds when it has been waiting a long time to be said. They called Dale the next week. He came out on a Saturday, and Ruth walked him through the harvest numbers at the kitchen table, the per-acre yield, and the premium price, and the arithmetic that produced the final figure. He sat with his hands around a coffee cup and listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said, "I want to understand the drainage mechanism well enough to write something useful. I'd like to try to get this into the county's site selection guidance." He spent 4 Saturdays at the table, and in the grove over the following 2 months, going through the journals with Ruth and asking questions about the methods with the careful attention of someone who had decided that the education available to him was in that place and not somewhere else. He was not a young man, but he was a thorough one, and the 5 pages of notes he made in his own notebook during those visits were detailed and specific in the way that only comes from someone genuinely trying to understand. In the spring of 2024, Ruth held the first of what became a regular Saturday morning gathering in the grove. She invited 3 neighboring families who farmed on the Sandhill margins of the county, land that had been grazed but never planted, because the conventional guidance had always said it wasn't suitable for cultivation. 2 of the families had sons who had come back to the land after working elsewhere, and who had the same combination of practical experience and formal training that Ruth had. She walked them through the Sandhill drainage principle, and the deep-root discipline, and the zinc and mineral amendment protocol that her father had developed over 3 decades of observation. She showed them the journal. She showed them the native tree in the draw still producing, its roots in ground that no one had ever prepared for it. She told them that the method was not complicated, and that the investment was time and attention, and the willingness to let trees find their own water in soil that most people would tell them was wrong for the purpose. One of the returning sons, a young man named Marcus, who had studied soil science and had spent 5 years consulting before coming back to the family place, asked the question Ruth had been waiting for someone to ask. How long before the trees are producing at this level? 15 years to full production, she said. Maybe 12 if the seasons cooperate. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him running the arithmetic of his own age against the timeline, the way she had once done it herself. "Your father started at 62, she said. Marcus looked out across the grove toward the south-facing row where the oldest trees stood with their wide canopies and their bark gone gray with decades of sun, trees that had been planted on ground that the county's best expert had dismissed in front of 63 witnesses, trees that had found their water at 11 feet down in free-draining sand and had been finding it every year since. "Then I'm ahead of schedule," he said. Before those families left that Saturday, Ruth went inside and came back with the top journal from the stack on the kitchen shelf, the first composition notebook, the one Ida had begun on the 1st of January 1988. She opened it to the first entry and read it aloud. The handwriting was careful, and the entry was plain, the way everything Ida wrote was plain. It recorded the weather that week and the condition of the 40 young trees and the first measurement Clint had taken of the soil moisture at a 2-foot probe depth. Then it recorded a single observation he had made walking the south row at dusk, which Ida had put in quotation marks because she had copied it from what he said and wanted to preserve the exact words. "They're reaching," the entry read. "Give them time and ground that drains, and they'll find what they need." The journal had been in that house for 36 years, and the statement in it had been true for every one of them. There are two ways to know a piece of ground. One is to arrive with a model built from measured averages, from the literature compiled across a region and a range of conditions, and to read the ground against that model. This is a legitimate and valuable kind of knowledge. It is efficient and transmissible, and it is usually right. The person who holds it has done real work to earn it, and the county is better off for having someone who holds it. The other way is to watch one particular piece of ground across enough seasons that the model no longer mediates what you see, that you see what is actually there rather than what the model predicts should be there. You know which draw holds moisture 2 weeks after a rain. You know which slope the feeder roots will find most favorable. You know that the tree growing without anyone's help in the sandy draw has been teaching a lesson for 50 years that the extension literature had not yet caught up to. This kind of knowledge does not transmit easily. It cannot be generalized without losing what makes it specific. It accumulates slowly, over decades, and it is invisible to anyone who has not done the watching. The structural shock, when it came, did not choose sides. It simply revealed which kind of knowing had been built for the year the average failed. The wet seasons of 2015 and 2016 and 2017 saturated the ground that the model had identified as best, and the organism that lives in saturated ground did what organisms do when conditions are right. No one engineered that outcome. No one planned for it. Clint Jennings had not planted on Sandhill soil because he was smarter than Dale Schuster or more principled than Boyd Hennessy. He had planted there because he had watched a tree grow without anyone's help in that ground for 30 years and had trusted what he saw. What a system measures and what is truly valuable are not always the same, and the distance between them is sometimes not visible until the year the average fails and the two paths diverge and one of them holds. Clint Jennings knew that distance. He walked it for 34 years, from the day he drove the first post-hole auger into the sandhill with 40 bare root trees waiting in the truck bed, to the morning his daughter sat at the kitchen table he had built from a cedar log off the property and read a number aloud to a quiet room. He never defended himself. He never lectured anyone. He answered questions in short, level sentences and went back to work. There is a native pecan tree in a low draw at the south end of the Sandhill tract, older than anyone alive who has walked the property. It does not produce every year. In the years it produces, the nuts are thin-shelled and rich and taste, as Ida always said, like something. Ruth checks on it when she walks the south row in October. She does not do anything to it. She has learned, finally, to leave things that are already finding what they need.